Welcome back to the woods. Find a quiet place, maybe a cup of tea or something warm, and let's step together into a slower world, where the days pass gently and small creatures live simple, beautiful lives beneath the trees. The brook beneath alder shade. The first light of morning spilled softly through the alder branches, turning the dewdrops along the path into tiny, trembling mirrors. Mist hung low over the stream, threading between the roots like pale silk, and the air smelled faintly of cool water and moss. A hedgehog shuffled along the bank, a wicker basket strapped to his back, filled with clean linen and a loaf of oat bread still warm from the hearth. He wasn't in any hurry. The path followed the gentle bend of the brook, leading toward a small footbridge that crossed to the far meadow. The bridge had stood for years, weathered and creaking, but dependable, built by paws long gone and mended a dozen times since. As the hedgehog approached, the soft murmur of water grew louder, not quite the steady song he was used to, but broken now and then by an uneven rush. He paused. The bridge leaned slightly, one corner sagging where the last rain had eaten at the supports. The planks still held, though they bowed under his weight when he tested them. That won't do," he muttered, rubbing his chin. He looked around for fallen branches or stones to brace it with, but the ground was slick, the brook swollen from the week's steady drizzle. A rustle from across the water drew his attention. The squirrel, nimble and bright-eyed, was already gathering twigs nearby. A basket looped over her shoulder. "Morning," she called. "Mind the far plank. It's loose." "I see that," said the hedgehog. "You've an eye for trouble early as ever." "Someone has to," she said with a grin, hopping lightly onto the bank. "You heading to the weavers again?" He nodded. She asked for more linen. "Seems her last batch went damp before it dried." The squirrel leaned against the rail, watching the water tumble past. "I could fetch the badger later. He'll know what to do with the bridge. You've seen how he works, precise as clock gears." "That would be kind," said the hedgehog. "If it collapses, half the woods will have to walk the long way round the hollow." They stood a while, watching the current swirl around the leaning support. The surface caught the light in flickering patterns, gold and green and silver. The squirrel dipped a paw in, flicked a droplet toward him, and laughed when it landed on his snout. "Cheeky," he said, but couldn't help smiling. Before leaving, they shared a small meal by the alder roots. Oat bread, apple slices, and a handful of last autumn's hazelnuts the squirrel had kept stored away. The hedgehog poured tea from a small flask, the steam curling in the crisp air. The forest woke slowly around them. A blackbird sang from a high branch, its call pure and bright, and somewhere farther down the brook, a frog croaked like a small drumbeat. The smell of wet bark and sun-warmed leaves mingled with the faint smoke from their flask. When at last they rose, the squirrel promised she'd find the badger by noon. "He'll want something to eat first," she warned. "Bring that bread of yours if you want him to work faster." The hedgehog chuckled. "I'll save a slice then." By midday, clouds gathered again, thick, gray, and heavy with the smell of more rain. The hedgehog finished his errands and returned the same way, basket now empty save for a few small cloths wrapped in twine. The bridge hadn't yet been mended, but a new length of wood lay beside it, fresh cut. Someone had already begun the work. He crouched and examined the grain. The cut was clean, smooth, and measured, Badger's doing surely. The air thickened, dim with the first signs of drizzle. He hurried across, paws slipping slightly on the damp planks, and found the badger himself a little farther along the path, kneeling by a fallen branch. His fur was flecked with sawdust, a small hatchet resting at his side. "Ah, you've seen the bridge, then," said the badger without looking up. "I have. You were quick." "Can't leave the thing tilting like that," said the badger. Another day of rain, and it'd give way entirely. The hedgehog nodded, resting his basket on a stone. "You'll have help at least." The squirrel said she'd come back. She already did, said the badger, motioning to the pile of planks nearby. Carried those from the clearing. I'll need to fit them in place before nightfall if I can. The hedgehog sat beside him, drawing out the last slice of bread and wrapping it in cloth. You might work faster with this. The badger's whiskers twitched with amusement. I won't say no. They ate together beneath the wide leaves, the patter of rain beginning in earnest now. Soft at first, then steady, drumming on bark and moss. The forest grew darker, its colors deepening, green to emerald, brown to bronze. The scent of rain filled everything, clean and grounding. After the meal, the hedgehog stayed to hand the badger nails, to hold the beams steady while he hammered. Each strike echoed gently through the clearing. It was a quiet rhythm, the sound of work done without haste, each motion careful, necessary. When they finished the first side, the rain eased, leaving mist rising from the earth like smoke. The brook ran fuller now, quick and bright, but the new supports held firm. The badger leaned on his hammer. It'll do for now, he said. Once it dries, I'll seal it proper. The hedgehog looked across the bridge, where the squirrel's paw prints still dotted the mud. Funny how much the little things matter, he said softly. A loose plank, a missing nail, and suddenly the woods feel farther apart. The badger nodded. That's why we fix them. Small things keep us together. They packed their tools and walked back toward the path, the forest sighing gently in the rain. Somewhere behind them, the brook kept on singing, its voice a little steadier now. The next morning broke bright and sharp, the world scrubbed clean. Mist still clung to the lower hollows, but sunlight spilled through the canopy in rich, warm beams. The hedgehog returned to the bridge with a small parcel wrapped in leaves. A thank you breakfast for the badger and the squirrel both. Soft honey rolls, still sweet and warm. But when he arrived, he found the squirrel already there, perched on the railing, tail flicking lazily. You're early, she said with a grin. So are you, he replied, offering her one of the rolls. I couldn't resist seeing it mended, she said. Looks as good as new. And it did. The planks sat even, the rails steady. The brook passed beneath them with a calm, liquid sound. The world felt just a little more whole again. The two of them sat quietly, sharing the rolls and watching the sunlight glint across the water. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, and a single feather drifted downstream, turning slowly as it went. It's strange, said the squirrel after a while. You spend so much time fixing little things, bridges, fences, paths, and you never quite realize how much they hold the forest together until one breaks. The hedgehog nodded, chewing thoughtfully. I suppose that's true of most things. It's not until they go missing that you notice what they carried. The squirrel smiled softly, eyes distant for a moment. Maybe that's what keeps us busy, mending the quiet things so the loud ones don't fall apart. The breeze stirred, cool and gentle, carrying with it the smell of damp bark and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle from the far field. The day went on slowly, peacefully, the kind of day that left its mark not in grand events, but in the steady sense that things were in their right places again. The morning had softened into a mild, silvery light. A thin haze drifted through the trees, not quite fog and not quite rain, but something between, the kind of air that blurred the line between earth and sky. The hedgehog stood at his door, sniffing the air with the practiced instinct of one who could read weather better than any almanac. He could feel it coming, a long, slow rain, the kind that began in whispers and didn't stop until every leaf gleamed and every burrow smelled faintly of damp wool. He wasn't worried. The roof had been thatched last week, but it meant work needed finishing early. Across the clearing, the squirrel darted among the trees, a flash of russet against the pale bark. She carried an armful of moss and dry twigs, her tail flicking rapidly to keep balance. You'll get caught in it, the hedgehog called. Not if I hurry, she said, though her grin betrayed that she didn't really mind if she did. The hedgehog watched her for a moment, then went to fetch his small wheelbarrow. Inside were 2 wooden pails, one filled with sand from the brook, the other with small pebbles. He planned to shore up the path before it turned to muck. The forest was quiet in that strange, expectant way before rainfall. Every sound felt sharper. The creak of branches, the occasional drop of moisture falling from a leaf, the soft thud of his barrow wheel on earth. By the time he reached the brook, the light had dimmed. Clouds had gathered thick and gray, low enough to catch on the tallest trees. The water ran quickly from the past days of drizzle, brown and swirling, carrying petals and bits of bark downstream. The badger was already there, sleeves rolled up, working by the new bridge. He looked up as the hedgehog arrived. Thought I'd give another check before the rain starts proper, he said. Still holding. Stronger than ever, said the badger. Though if it floods again, we might need another beam on the far side. They worked side by side for a while, the hedgehog spreading sand across the path, the badger hammering a loose nail back into place. The air grew heavier, more fragrant, smelling of wet bark, fern, and the faint sweetness of pine sap. Then came the rain, gentle at first, barely more than a shimmer. The surface of the brook rippled in countless small rings. Leaves bowed under the growing weight of droplets, sending tiny cascades down through the undergrowth. Neither of them moved to leave. The badger tilted his head back, eyes closed, letting the rain wash the dust from his fur. I always like this kind, he said softly. Steady, honest rain. Reminds you the earth's still alive beneath it all. The hedgehog nodded, and the forest always smells its best afterward. By the time the downpour settled into a rhythm, the squirrel arrived, half-drenched but unbothered, clutching a bundle of moss to her chest. Knew I'd find you two here, she said, dropping it onto the path. This will help the footing once it dries. You've brought half the forest with you, the badger chuckled. Only the soft bits, she said. They worked under the rain for the rest of the morning, the kind of work that moves slowly but contentedly. Every so often they'd stop to share a sip of tea or wipe rain from their brows. Conversation came and went in brief, gentle threads, small things, familiar things, the kind of talk that passes easily between those who've known one another long enough not to need to fill the quiet. By noon, the rain began to thin. The sound shifted from drumming to dripping, and thin shafts of light began to pierce through the cloud cover. Mist rose from the brook, curling like breath. The badger gathered his tools, the squirrel wrung out her tail, and the hedgehog covered his wheelbarrow with a bit of linen. Come up to my burrow, said the hedgehog. It'll take another hour before the ground's fit for walking. I'll put the kettle on. The badger nodded. I'll not say no to that. They followed the path up the small rise behind the alder grove. The hedgehog's burrow sat neatly under a root, its round window shining faintly from within. Inside, it was warm and tidy, the kind of place where everything had its spot and smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood polish. He laid a small fire and hung a kettle over it. Soon the scent of mint and dried orange peel filled the room. The squirrel perched on a stool near the window, watching the dripping leaves outside, while the badger stretched out his legs near the hearth. It's strange, said the squirrel after a while. I always think I've seen every kind of rain this forest has, but somehow each one feels new. The hedgehog smiled faintly. That's because the forest itself changes with it. No two rains fall on the same leaves. The badger grunted in approval. You sound like my grandfather. He used to say a thing like that every time the seasons turned. Smart creature, your grandfather, said the hedgehog. The badger chuckled. Stubborn, more like. But he did know how to listen to the weather. They lingered long into the afternoon, sipping tea while the world beyond their window dripped and sighed. The fire crackled softly, throwing a pale glow against the wooden walls. It was the sort of moment that felt both fleeting and endless, a pause between things where the only task left was to sit and exist in quiet company. When the rain finally stopped, the forest outside looked freshly made. Every leaf gleamed. Every fern stood tall and rinsed of dust. Drops hung from the moss like beads of glass. The brook, swollen but clear, ran quick and confident under the mended bridge. The hedgehog stepped outside and drew a deep breath. The air was rich and cool. The sky pale blue once more. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we'll find the mushrooms by the lower glade. This kind of rain always brings them out." The squirrel's eyes lit. "I'll bring my basket, and I'll bring a bigger kettle," said the badger. They laughed quietly. The sound carried gently through the damp, bright wood. The next day came bright and clean, sunlight running like honey over the grass. Birds chattered from every branch. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel new again. The hedgehog woke early, humming as he packed his satchel. A bit of bread, some cheese wrapped in cloth, a small tin of sweet plum jam, his favorite. He meant to take it along to share with the others during their mushroom hunt. When he stepped outside, the air was cool and full of scent, wet earth, fern, and the faint perfume of late honeysuckle. The path to the lower glade ran beside the brook, where the water had calmed again to its usual gentle murmur. The squirrel was already there, crouched under an elder tree, checking the soil. "Plenty today," she said, pointing to a ring of pale mushrooms hidden beneath the leaves. "Ah, the good kind," said the hedgehog. "You've a keen eye. It helps to look where no one else bothers," she said. "These grow where the light falls just right. Not too much, not too little." The badger arrived soon after, carrying a small woven basket and a walking stick polished smooth from use. "Let's hope the rain didn't drown them all," he said. They worked through the morning, picking carefully, trimming stems, and leaving smaller caps behind to grow. Conversation floated lightly between them, punctuated by bird song and the rustle of leaves. When the sun climbed high, they stopped by the brook to rest. The hedgehog unpacked his satchel, but when he looked inside, he frowned. "What's wrong?" asked the squirrel. "My jam tin," he said, blinking. "It's gone. Gone. I packed it this morning. I remember setting it beside the bread." He rummaged again, checked under the cloth. Nothing. The badger raised a brow. "Could have fallen out on the path." The hedgehog sighed. "It was my last bit of plum jam. I'd been saving it since midsummer." The squirrel tapped her chin thoughtfully. "We'll find it. The path's not far. If it fell, it can't have rolled far downstream." They split up along the brook, checking under roots, among the ferns, and by the smooth stones where the current curled. The forest shimmered with light, birds darting between branches, water gleaming where it caught the sun. It wasn't a hurried search, but a patient, careful one. The hedgehog followed the stream's bend and soon spotted something glinting near a patch of reeds. There, half buried in moss, lay the little tin, its lid still tight, but its sides flecked with mud. He lifted it gently, wiping it clean on a leaf. Relief washed through him like warm tea after rain. When he returned to the others, the squirrel clapped her paws. "Found it, right where it shouldn't have been," he said, smiling. They settled again by the brook. The hedgehog opened the tin, revealing the deep amber jam within, still gleaming and sweet-smelling. He spread it over small pieces of bread, handing them out. The taste was as he remembered, sharp, rich, and comforting all at once. The squirrel hummed in contentment, and even the badger, not much for sweets, nodded approvingly. "You know," said the badger after a while, "funny how losing something makes it taste twice as good when you find it again." "Maybe that's true of more than just jam," said the squirrel softly. The brook murmured agreement, or so it seemed, its steady voice winding between the roots. The sunlight dappled their faces, the scent of wild mint drifting nearby. By the time they packed up, the shadows had lengthened, and the forest glowed with the soft, golden light of late afternoon. And when the hedgehog finally placed the jam tin back on his shelf that evening, clean, polished, and half full, he smiled to himself. Sometimes, he thought, small adventures were all the forest ever needed. The day after the jam was found dawned bright and breezy, the air sharp with the scent of pine and the faintest edge of coming autumn. The forest had that certain clarity it only wore in early September, each sound carrying crisply, each color made richer by the sun. The hedgehog woke early, his mind still turning over thoughts of the previous day's small adventure. He stepped outside to find the morning mist lifting like slow smoke from a meadow. Dew clung thick to the grass, and a spider's web stretched between two reeds, glinting like glass filigree. He breathed deep, the kind of breath that fills the chest and eases the mind, and smiled. Today would be a fine day to cook. From inside his burrow came the faint smell of dried thyme and bread warming by the fire. He'd already laid out a few things the night before. A small earthen pot, some herbs bundled in string, a clean knife polished bright. The plan was simple. Use the mushrooms they gathered for a shared meal, something warm and fragrant to mark the slow turn of the season. By mid-morning, the squirrel arrived, arms full of herbs and chestnuts. "I thought these would do," she said, setting them on the table. "And I've a bit of cream left from the badger's store, if he remembers to bring it." The hedgehog chuckled. He'll remember. Cream's not something he lets slip from mind. True enough, the badger appeared soon after, carrying a clay jar under one arm and a small bundle wrapped in linen under the other. "Found a few wild leeks near the brook," he said, laying them out. "They'll give the stew some proper flavor." The hedgehog's burrow wasn't large, but it had a certain comforting order. Shelves lined with jars, the scent of dried flowers hanging in the air, and a small table set near the window where the light fell gently across the wood. They worked there in quiet harmony, the squirrel trimming stems with deft little paws, the badger peeling leeks with practiced precision, and the hedgehog stirring a pot already half filled with broth. The sound of chopping mixed with the rhythmic scrape of a spoon against clay. Occasionally, one of them would speak, a brief word about the weather, or a comment on how the broth smelled richer than last season's. When the mushrooms went in, the scent changed completely. It deepened, grew earthy and sweet at once, filling the burrow until it seemed the forest itself had come indoors. The steam fogged the little window, turning the view of the brook into a soft blur of color and light. They set the table with simple care: wooden bowls, a pot of blackberry jam from the squirrel stores, and a loaf of oat bread still warm from the hearth. The fire crackled softly in the corner, and a faint breeze from the open door carried the scent of wet bark and fallen leaves. When they finally sat to eat, the world outside felt hushed, as though even the forest listened to the sound of spoons against bowls. The stew was perfect, rich, soft, full of warmth. The leeks had melted into the broth, the mushrooms tender, the herbs bright. The badger grunted approval between bites. "You've outdone yourself, hedgehog." The hedgehog smiled modestly. "It's the forest's doing, not mine. I only borrowed its flavor." The squirrel tore a piece of bread, dipping it into her bowl. "Then the forest deserves thanks." They raised their spoons in quiet toast. The moment lingered, slow and easy, the kind of silence that carries meaning all its own. After they'd eaten, they took their bowls outside to wash them in the brook. The afternoon light had turned golden now, slanting through the trees, setting the water aglow. The forest buzzed with quiet life. The hum of bees near the asters, the rustle of mice in the ferns, the faint echo of a woodpecker far away. The badger stood by the bridge, arms folded, watching the current. "You know," he said, "there's something about a meal shared that makes the woods feel smaller. Like we're all closer somehow." The hedgehog nodded. "Small things again," he said softly. Always, said the squirrel, smiling. They lingered there as the sun lowered, the air cooling. When at last they parted, it was with the easy comfort of those who knew they would meet again soon, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after, to find some new small task worth doing together. That night, the forest seemed to hum with quiet satisfaction. The rain from days before had left every living thing full and green, and the brook ran smooth as silk under the starlight. The hedgehog sat on the small bench outside his door, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the fireflies flicker near the reeds. A pot of tea steamed beside him on the step, mint and chamomile, light and soothing. The taste carried the faint memory of the day. Mushroom stew, the warmth of friends' laughter, the smell of rain-soaked leaves. A soft sound of steps came along the path. The squirrel, her fur catching glints of moonlight, carrying a small pouch slung over her shoulder. Couldn't sleep, she said. The air's too fine for that. The hedgehog nodded toward the bench. Sit then. The tea's still hot. She poured herself a cup, the steam rising pale against the dark. For a while, neither spoke. The forest around them was alive but peaceful. The croak of frogs near the brook, the soft whisper of a night breeze stirring the tall grass, the distant call of an owl. It's strange, she said eventually, her voice low. You spend so much time thinking about what to do, where to go next, and then you have a day like this, quiet, full of small things, and you realize it's enough. The hedgehog nodded slowly. That's the trick of the woods. It teaches you to stop looking past what's in front of you. She smiled faintly, tracing the rim of her cup. You sound like the badger. Maybe I'm getting wise in my old age. They both laughed softly. The brook caught the moonlight then, throwing a pale shimmer across the trees. A night bird swooped low over the water and vanished in a shadow. The hedgehog refilled their cups. Tomorrow I'll gather the apples by the old oak. You're welcome to come help if you'd like. I will, she said. We'll bake something together. Maybe a pie this time. Only if we don't eat all the filling first. Her laughter rang bright and brief through the dark. No promises. They sat until the tea cooled, until the fireflies faded into the deeper dark of night, and the forest seemed to breathe slow and deep around them. The hedgehog felt his eyelids grow heavy, the warmth of the tea soft in his chest. When the squirrel finally stood to leave, she paused at the bridge, looking back. The hedgehog raised a paw in farewell. Good night, hedgehog. Good night, squirrel. Her shadow slipped away among the trees, and the sound of her steps faded into the soft rhythm of the brook. The hedgehog lingered a little longer, finishing his tea. The stars had begun to dim, their light paling in the mist that crept low through the grass. Soon enough he went inside, snuffed the lantern, and curled beneath his blanket. The burrow was quiet, the smell of mint still faint in the air. Outside, the forest slept, calm, steady, full of the quiet promise of another gentle day. The dawn broke with a clarity that only came after several days of rain. The air bright, cold at first, but carrying a sweetness that promised warmth later on. Mist drifted through the meadow like breath, pooling in the hollows and catching the first threads of sunlight as they crept between the trees. The hedgehog stepped out of his burrow just as the dew caught flame in the grass, glimmering gold and white beneath his paws. He carried a woven basket, the same one he used for berries in summer and chestnuts in autumn, its handle smooth from years of use. Today, though, it was meant for apples. The orchard beyond the alder grove had begun to flush red, and the branches hung heavy, bending under the weight of ripened fruit. He walked slowly, taking in the forest as it stirred awake. The robins were already singing in their short, bright phrases. A woodpecker drummed somewhere far off. The sound of the brook carried its usual patient music. There was something profoundly peaceful in that hour before the day fully began, when the world still seemed half asleep and the first light brushed gently across every surface. The squirrel was waiting for him by the edge of the orchard, perched on the low branch of a hawthorn, tail flicking lazily. "I thought you'd never wake," she teased. "I wake with the sun," the hedgehog said, smiling. "You just rise earlier than most suns do." She laughed and leapt down lightly, her paws landing soft on the damp soil. "You brought the basket?" He held it up, "and a bit of cloth for wrapping, so they won't bruise." The orchard was a quiet place, not planted by anyone they knew, perhaps not by anyone still alive, but tended by the forest itself. The trees grew in gentle rows, their trunks gnarled with age, their roots twined deep in the moss. Dew still clung to the fruit, each apple shining with its own small star of reflected light. They began to gather slowly, choosing carefully, speaking little. Every so often, the squirrel would leap up the branches to reach the higher fruit, tossing them down one by one with careful aim. The hedgehog caught each one in a fold of his cloth, placing them neatly in the basket. The air smelled of apple skins and grass, sharp and sweet at once. Overhead, clouds drifted in long, slow waves, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. Not yet the sound of autumn's chill, but close. When their baskets were nearly full, they paused to rest beneath one of the trees. The squirrel leaned against the trunk, eating a slice she'd bitten clean through, juice glinting on her whiskers. "I always forget how quiet it is here," she said softly. "It feels like the world stops moving for a little while." "It does," said the hedgehog, "but only so it can listen." "To what? To itself, maybe." She smiled, half closing her eyes. "You really are getting wise, hedgehog." He chuckled. "Only when there's fruit to eat." They stayed there until the sun climbed higher, the light warming their fur, the air filling with the low hum of bees and the wildflowers between the trees. The brook, not far off, gleamed like a moving ribbon of glass. When they finally stood to leave, the baskets were brimming, one with the pale green kind that bakes soft and sweet, the other with crisp red ones meant for eating raw. Together they started back along the path, the weight of the apples a pleasant ache in their arms. By the time they reached the hedgehog's burrow, the badger was already there, seated on the bench outside, cleaning the blade of his small hatchet. "You've been gone half the day," he said. "I was about to send a search party." "You'd have found us under the trees," said the squirrel, setting down her basket. "We couldn't stop picking. They're the best this year." The badger looked them over, the faintest hint of a grin under his whiskers. "I can see that. Smells good enough from here." The hedgehog opened his door and gestured inside. "Come on, both of you. We'll make something of them before the light fades." The hedgehog's burrow filled quickly with the smell of apples and wood smoke. The squirrel washed and peeled while the badger sliced, his thick paws surprisingly gentle with a knife. The hedgehog prepared the dough, working the flour and butter together until it came together in a soft ball that smelled faintly of warmth and comfort. Outside, the light dimmed slowly, turning the walls of the burrow gold. The sound of the brook came faint through the window, steady and calm, as always, and the occasional bird called from the fading sky. The squirrel hummed while she worked, some old tune without words. Every now and then she'd sneak a sliver of apple, pretending not to notice when the hedgehog saw her. "You leave us with nothing to bake," he said. "There'll be enough," she replied through a grin. "Besides, someone has to test them." The badger chuckled. "She's right. Wouldn't do to bake sour fruit." When the dough was ready, they spread it in a small earthen dish, layered the apples, sprinkled cinnamon and crushed nuts on top, and drizzled a bit of honey. The hedgehog slid it into the hearth's warm center, where the coals glowed orange. As they waited, they sat around the fire, sipping tea. The light inside the burrow flickered gently, catching in the glass jars and throwing soft patterns along the walls. "I think," said the badger after a while, "this might be my favorite time of year. Everything's changing, but it doesn't feel like an ending yet. The squirrel nodded. It's the in-between, she said. Not quite summer, not quite autumn. It's when the forest seems most alive. The hedgehog stirred his tea, watching the steam curl upward. Maybe it's because it knows what's coming, the cold, the quiet, and it's making the most of now. They fell silent for a while after that, listening to the fire and the faint bubbling from the hearth. The smell of the baking pie deepened, rich and spicy, filling the room until it was almost too good to bear. When it was done, they set on the table, golden and glistening at the edges. Steam rose in thin curls. The squirrel's eyes widened. "Oh, look at it. It looks like a bit of sunshine," said the badger. They waited only as long as politeness demanded before cutting the first slice. The crust was soft, the filling sweet and tender, the flavor of cinnamon lingering. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the small sounds of forks and quiet sighs of contentment. When the plates were empty, the hedgehog leaned back and looked toward the window. The forest outside was dark now, lit only by the pale silver of the moon. The brook glimmered faintly in the distance, and an owl hooted somewhere up the ridge. "I suppose," he said softly, "we'll have to gather firewood soon. Nights like this won't stay warm much longer." The badger nodded. "I'll help tomorrow. We can stack it by the bridge good and dry before frost." The squirrel smiled faintly, her chin resting on her paws. "And maybe after that, we'll bake something else. Something smaller, perhaps," said the hedgehog, chuckling. "If only for the sake of my shelves." They laughed together, the sound filling the little burrow and spilling softly into the night beyond. The fire crackled, the forest breathed, and the scent of baked apples lingered long after the last crumbs were gone. Outside, the first leaves began to fall, slowly, quietly, carried on a wind that spoke of the season turning, not with sadness, but with calm acceptance. The forest would change, as it always did, and so would they. But for now, the night was warm, and the company good, and the world, in its small, perfect way, felt whole. The next morning came with a gray sky and a restless wind moving through the trees. It was not the kind of wind that carried rain or thunder, not yet, but one that spoke softly of change, brushing the forest in long, shivering breaths. The leaves had begun their slow drift to gold, and when the hedgehog stepped outside, he could smell autumn on the air, sharp, earthy, and faintly sweet, like apples forgotten in the grass. The badger was already up by the old bridge, stacking wood with practiced patience. The logs were thick and uniform, cut from a fallen alder and split clean through. A small fire smoldered beside him, warming a kettle. The hedgehog crossed the clearing, his paws crunching softly on the leaves. "Morning," he called, voice slightly muffled by a scarf. The badger turned, his fur brushed with ash from the fire. "You're up early. Thought you'd still be sleeping after yesterday's feast." "I tried," the hedgehog admitted, but the wind kept whispering in the burrow. "It sounds like the forest is moving." The badger nodded, tossing another log onto the pile. "It always does this time of year. The trees loosen their grip before the frost. Makes the woods sound alive." For a while, they worked in silence. Only the rhythm of splitting, stacking, and the gentle crackle of the fire filling the space between them. The air was cool enough that their breath showed faintly. Now and then, a flock of starlings passed overhead, dark swirls against the dim morning, and the smell of smoke mingled with damp earth. By midday, the squirrel arrived with a satchel of hazelnuts slung across her shoulder. "You two look like you've been fighting the forest," she said, peering at their sooty paws. "Winning, I hope," said the badger, wiping his brow. "There's tea if you'd like some." "I'd like all of it," she said, sinking down beside the fire. "It's getting colder every day. I woke to frost on my windowsill this morning." The hedgehog looked up from where he sat, binding a bundle of kindling. "Already?" It's early for that. Just a hint of it, she replied. But you can feel it coming. The pond near my tree had a thin glaze of ice on the edges. The badger poured her tea, and they sat together for a while, watching the steam rise into the still air. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the birds quieter than usual, the leaves whispering in low tones. Even the brook sounded subdued, its song softer, as though weighed down by the chill. "Strange, isn't it?" said the squirrel after a while. "We spend all year waiting for this, the season of rest, but when it comes, it feels like saying goodbye." "It's not goodbye," said the hedgehog. "Just a pause. The forest never really stops. It just slows its heartbeat for a while." The badger smiled faintly at that. "And gives us time to eat the apples we hoarded." They laughed quietly, and for a while longer, the wind passed through the branches above like a soft, invisible river. When they finally stood, the light had begun to thin, slanting gold and gray between the trees. They tied up the last of the wood bundles and carried them toward the hedgehog's burrow, their voices low and steady against the murmuring of the forest. By the time the first frost came, the burrows were lined, the shelves stocked, and the day shorter by a full hour. Morning mist clung longer in the valleys, and the sun, when it rose, cast a pale, watery light through the thinning canopy. The forest had changed its sound, quieter now, more deliberate, every movement of leaf and branch seeming to carry meaning. The hedgehog woke early again, stirred by the crispness of the air. He brewed a small pot of tea and stepped outside with his cup, watching as the frost glittered across the grass. The brook had slowed a little, its edges caught in thin lacework of ice. The sound was gentle, almost tender. The squirrel arrived not long after, her fur puffed against the cold, clutching a bundle wrapped in linen. "Morning," she chirped, breath clouding. "I brought something." "What's this?" asked the hedgehog. She unwrapped it with a little flourish. Inside were round, golden biscuits, each one dotted with pieces of dried apple and a touch of cinnamon. "I tried baking," she said proudly. "Used the last of the apples we saved." The hedgehog smiled. "They look perfect. They taste better with tea," she added quickly, handing him one. He took a bite, warm, sweet, and faintly spiced, and nodded appreciatively. "You've outdone yourself." Before long, the badger joined them, wrapped in his thick coat and carrying a small wooden box. "Thought I'd bring something too," he said, setting it down. Inside were smooth, polished stones, each shaped carefully by the brook, their colors muted but lovely, gray, amber, pale blue. "For the hearth," he explained. "They'll hold heat when the fire burns low." The squirrel traced one of the stones with her paw. "You really think of everything." "I just like being ready," he replied. "The cold doesn't wait for us." They spent the morning together in quiet company. The hedgehog swept the burrow's entrance. The squirrel mended a torn blanket, and the badger fitted the stones around the hearth. When the work was done, they sat down again, this time inside, where the air was already warming from the fire. "Do you remember," said the squirrel, gazing at the flickering light, "the summer we spent by the lake? When we built that raft that barely floated?" The hedgehog laughed softly. "Barely floated is generous. It was more of a wet log with ambition." The badger chuckled. "You both looked like drowned rats." They shared stories as the day drifted toward evening, of summers past, of storms weathered, of small triumphs like the time the hedgehog's garden finally sprouted after weeks of rain. The conversation moved slowly, comfortably, the way leaves fall without hurry. Outside, the frost began to gather again, spreading over the moss and branches, catching the moonlight until the forest shimmered like glass. Inside, the fire popped softly, and the warmth of it wrapped them all in a calm that felt deep and ancient. As the night grew late, the squirrel yawned, curling into the armchair near the hearth. "It's strange," she murmured, half asleep, how the quietest days can feel the fullest. The hedgehog nodded, his eyes heavy. That's the way of the woods. It gives what it has slowly. The badger added another log to the fire, the flames leaping briefly before settling again. Then we'd best be slow too. And so they were. The forest outside whispered with the sound of wind brushing through the last dry leaves, a language older than memory, gentle and constant. The fire burned low, and their voices faded into the hum of the night. The frost deepened, the stars shone with winter's clarity, and all through the quiet grove, the world rested, still, patient, and perfectly content. The morning it came, the forest woke to silence. Not the kind of silence that felt empty or cold, but one that softened everything, muffling sound and time alike. The hedgehog opened his door to a world turned white. The path, the bushes, even the old stone near the brook covered in a delicate layer of snow, so fresh it still held the shape of the falling flakes. He stood for a moment, his breath visible, the air sharp and clean. The snow reflected the pale sky above, filling the clearing with a quiet, silvery glow. The trees bent under the weight, branches creaking faintly. From somewhere deeper in the woods came a soft thump. A small clump of snow dislodged from a bough, tumbling down to the forest floor. The hedgehog pulled his scarf tighter and stepped out. His footprints left clear marks in the untouched snow, and each step gave a soft crunch that echoed faintly in the still air. He followed the narrow trail toward the badger's den. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, coiling upward before disappearing into the gray sky. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, thick, comforting with the smell of pine wood and stew. "You're up early," rumbled the badger, stirring the pot with his usual focus. "I didn't expect anyone out before breakfast in this weather." "I had to see it," said the hedgehog, shaking the snow from his coat. "It's the first fall of the season." The badger smiled, setting down the spoon. "A fine one, too, the kind that stays." The squirrel arrived a little later, brushing snow from her fur, eyes bright. "It's beautiful out there," she exclaimed, hopping near the fire. "The whole forest looks like a dream." The badger chuckled. "Dream or not, it's cold enough to bite your tail off. Sit, both of you." They gathered around the table as he ladled out steaming bowls of vegetable stew, thick and fragrant, with carrots, barley, and a hint of rosemary. The warmth seeped through their paws, and soon the window panes fogged from the rising steam. For a long while, they ate in contented silence, listening to the faint hum of the fire and the occasional sigh of wind outside. Afterward, the hedgehog stood by the window, looking out. The snow was still falling, slower now, drifting in long, lazy patterns. "Do you think it'll last?" he asked. The badger nodded. "A week at least. The frost set deep this time." The squirrel tilted her head. "Then we should enjoy it. There won't be many days this bright until spring." And so they did. Later that morning, they ventured out together, bundled and careful, following the curve of the brook. The world had transformed overnight. The undergrowth hidden beneath smooth white mounds, the water edged in glass, the air hushed and reverent. Their breath hung in small clouds, and even their voices seemed gentler here. They came upon a meadow. They lay there for a while longer, saying nothing, until the first hint of sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting the world in a soft golden hue. It made the snow sparkle like frost on glass. When they finally returned home, tired and rosy, the forest had already begun to fade back into twilight. That night, the snow fell again, thicker now, heavier, settling into every crevice of the forest. The wind picked up just enough to make the trees groan softly, and the world outside the burrow disappeared behind a curtain of white. Inside, the hedgehog's burrow was warm and golden, lit by the steady glow of the hearth. The badger sat at the table, whittling a small wooden spoon, while the squirrel curled in the armchair, half buried under a wool blanket. The air smelled faintly of pine and bread, with a quiet crackle of burning wood filling the space between them. The hedgehog ladled soup into bowls and set them out. "Eat while it's hot," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll need to check the stores." The badger nodded. "Aye, but tonight we rest." They ate slowly, each bite comforting and familiar. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows, dulling even the faintest sound. It was as if the forest had drawn a blanket over itself, and the burrow was the only warm, living thing in the wide, sleeping world. After dinner, the squirrel rose and began to hum again, the same soft tune she always returned to on long nights. The badger kept carving, the small rasp of wooden knife almost rhythmic beside her melody. The hedgehog poured a little honey into the tea and handed around the mugs. For a long while, they didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed saying. The moment itself felt enough. The fire burned low, its light shifting and dancing on the walls. The squirrel's eyes grew heavy, and soon she dozed off, her head resting against the back of the chair. The badger set aside his carving and stretched, his joints popping quietly. "I'll be heading back soon," he said, "before the path disappears." The hedgehog looked toward the door. "You'll be all right in this?" The badger smiled faintly. "I've seen worse. The snow's no bother once you learn to move with it." He stood, wrapped his coat tight, and gave a small nod before stepping out into the whiteness. The cold rushed in briefly before the door shut again. For a moment, the hedgehog watched through the frosted glass as the badger's shape moved slowly down the path until it was swallowed by snow. Then there was only the quiet again. The hedgehog turned back to the fire. The squirrel murmured something in her sleep, the blanket slipping slightly down her shoulder. He adjusted it gently, then sat beside the hearth, the warmth soaking into his paws. He looked into flames for a long while, thinking, not about anything grand, but about the small things that made up their days, the first apples of autumn, the soft light of dawn, the laughter in the snow. The fire cracked softly, and outside, the storm eased to a whisper. Soon enough, he too fell asleep there by the fire, the light flickering gently across the burrow walls. The end. Thank you for wandering through the woods with me. If you'd like to return for more quiet stories and soft moments, don't forget to follow the trail back. Like, subscribe, and I'll meet you again under the green canopy soon.